I was a strange child. I know that's surprising to you, but when I was little, I always loved the bad guys more than I did the good guys. My parents would oftentimes at Christmas, want to get me the new toy, and I would always want the bad guys. I had a Darth Vader lightsaber because it was cool. And he was cool because he was big and bad and no one could stop him. But I wonder what was wrong with me. Should we be rooting for the bad guy? Should the bad guy be the one that we want to emulate and act like? Well, that's the quandary in the parable that we read in Luke chapter 16 and verses 1 through 9, sometimes referred to as the parable of the manager. It's a story about a manager who is squandering his master's possessions, gets caught, but yet somehow figures out a way to use his unscrupulous behavior to benefit him. And it's a guy that really, the manager, there's not much to root for. I mean, first of all, he's not that good at his job. He was squandering the possessions. He wasn't doing what he was supposed to do. He was lazy. We see him say there, I'm not strong enough to dig. He wouldn't actually go out and do a hard day's work. He was too proud to beg. He wasn't about to lower his standard. He was underhanded in how he dealt with the situation. In fact, he was willing to cheat his boss in order to gain favor with the people who owed him money. So why in the world would Jesus make him the hero of the story? The one who is lifted up. In fact, in the line in the text it says, and the master praised the unrighteous manager because he had acted shrewdly. The word here is, the root word is oftentimes translated as wise. It's given those. We might use the word today, smart. He was smart in what he did. He showed a intelligence there. And oftentimes intelligence is an attribute that we often give to the villain. I mean, think about how many movies and TV shows the bad guy is really smart, right? The serial killer is really, really intelligent. It's a common idea that we spread forth. In reality, that's not the case. In reality, usually it doesn't work that way. It's rather the exception. But yet we tend to think of it that way. Well, they must be really smart. Well, here in this passage, we're sending out his disciples. He says, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Be shrewd as serpents and innocent as doves. Notice here he says he wants them to maintain their innocence. He doesn't want them to be bad guys, but he still wants them to be smart. Smart as serpents. That was the idea, right? The serpent was the most clever creature. Well, here he's saying, I want you to be that way too, but I don't want you to take on those evil attributes. You see, because the point of this passage and what Jesus is trying to tell us here is that we need to be as smart as the world is smart. He says, because the sons of this age act more shrewdly, and telling us here something that tends to happen. The world tends to be a lot quicker on the take than the sons of light are. The reason is because the world is hard. The law of the jungle demands shrewdness. If you don't, you're eliminated. If you don't think yourself through, if you don't play it smart, well then someone else is going to take advantage of you. See, sometimes the sons of light, we let things slip maybe. I see it sometimes when you'll have maybe a business, you'll have a social structure, something that isn't doing what it's supposed to do. It isn't fulfilling that role. It isn't being wise in its business. It's not doing a good job. But yet people will sometimes feel a sentimentality for it, and they'll kind of prop it up, and then when it fails, they go, I just can't believe it happened. Well, maybe it didn't do what it was supposed to do. It wasn't providing the services it was supposed to. It wasn't doing a good enough job. But yet sometimes that sentimentality takes over. And We don't think in things in terms of what is the best thing, but kind of, well, that's what we want to have happen. And I think Jesus here is warning us we're doing things very poorly. And that we need to be as smart as that shrewd manager was. He wasn't a very good person, but he knew what he had to do to get done what he wanted to have done. He was smart about it. And that's what Jesus is challenging his people to be smart about it, to be wise, to be shrewd. In fact, that same word is used several different times in the New Testament text. And today I want to look at some ways that word is used, and maybe some ways the church might be thinking dumb. That we're not thinking in a way that is smart. We're not being shrewd in our decisions. So let's start with our first one. When we operate on the now instead of the when. There's another parable that Jesus tells that uses this same term, this shrewd idea. It's the parable of the 10 wise virgins and the 10 foolish virgins in Matthew chapter 25. You may coming of the bridegroom, but he's delayed in his coming. And because he is delayed, they have to break out their lamps for light. Now, all the lamps had some oil in them, but only the 5 wise ones thought enough to bring more oil. So at midnight, when the shout comes, him. 5 foolish ones, though, are not. And they're forced to run out and try to get some more oil. And while they're doing that, they miss out on everything. But it's those wise ones who were prepared. They trimmed their lamps. They were ready and went in to the wedding feast. In that story, of course, 2 groups are talked about. One that was, I want you to think about the point of the parable. What were they prepared for? They knew the bridegroom was coming. It could have been a long trip. Was this the expected outcome and the others just didn't do anything about it? No, it was kind of odd. You wouldn't expect him to wait and take till midnight. Could happen. But they were preparing instead of just reacting to it. They weren't sure what time the bridegroom was coming, but they knew anything could happen. And so they prepared themselves. You see that reflected in the last line in Matthew 25, verse 13, when he said, do not know the day or for what they knew at the moment, but they were preparing for what they didn't know but could happen. Not the now of what was going on, but the when, the what of could happen. How many times have you heard the phrase unprecedented times recently? Every commercials, they say that. We're living in unprecedented times. But I got thinking about that, and it's wrong for a couple reasons. One, because every time is unprecedented times. We don't know anything that's going to happen in the future. What's happening now is unique to itself. The people, the times, the places, the circumstances are all similar that we've gone through. It's not so unique that we would say anything else. Like Solomon said, there's nothing new under the sun. But the idea there is sometimes we think, well, there was no way we could have prepared ourselves for this. But maybe we could have. If we weren't just thinking about the moment, but we were thinking about the future. We weren't just reacting to the times now, but we were considering what is to come. Proverbs 29 verse 18 says this, where there is no vision, my people are unrestrained, but happy is he who keeps the law. The term vision here is the idea of God's foretelling, God's declaration of something. People aren't looking, when they're not considering that vision, they're unrestrained. They do whatever they want. But the converse here is interesting, but happy is he who keeps the law. He's saying here that if you're not considering what's to come, well, you can just do whatever you want. But the truly blessed person, the truly happy person, is one who looks at what God has said and keeps it. They're not just thinking about, well, what should I do now? Rather, they're looking for what's best in the wind. They're prepared, like those 10 virgins. They weren't just looking and saying, well, what do I have to get done right now? But they were saying, what do I have to do to get ready? You see, if we build roads, they will no longer go where we're wanting to go. We have to look to where we want to be and make our paths that way. We have to look at where we are going, where the destination of the future is. If we just try to, well, let's just make everybody happy now, well, that doesn't lead us anywhere. Years ago, when Winston Churchill was the Prime Minister of Great Britain, he was known for seeing what no one else saw. When others looked at Adolf Hitler as a reasonable man, Churchill saw the despot and what he represented. Years later, when the Soviet Union was beginning its conquest of Eastern Europe, many people weren't concerned about it, but Churchill saw it as an iron curtain descending across the continent. And once Churchill spoke those things, people began to see what he was talking about. How is it that Churchill could see so clearly when others couldn't about what was to come? He was quoted as saying, "The reason I can see so far into the future is I have read so far back into history." And it helped him to see what he needed to go, what was to come. Christians, the same thing is true for us today. The more that we study God's Word, the more that we look into His law, the more we'll be able to see what we need to do for the future. We need to know the bridegroom is coming. We need to know that the day or the hour is not known. And we need to think about that when, that it is there. And not just focus on the now, but on the future. It's wise thinking. But we also need to remember to not recline rather than refine. Another parable that Jesus gives that uses our term for shrewdness is the parable of the lazy servants in Luke chapter 12 and verses 42 through 46. Here it talks about the faithful and sensible steward, whom the master has put in charge of his servants to give them their rations at the proper time. Blessed is that slave whose master finds him so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But the slave that says in his heart, my master will be long to eat the slaves, both men and women, and to eat and drink and get drunk. The master of that slave will come in a day does he not expect, and an hour he does not know, and he will cut him to pieces and assign him a place with the unbelievers. You see, in this passage and even the text that precedes it, there's an idea here. Say, well, I'm where I need to be and not do anything. No, the servant that is wise is the one who is still active and busy doing what he's supposed to because he knows he doesn't know the when. And in order to be forward thinking, he's currently active. You know, we think of this passage and we think of somebody who was not doing what he was supposed to do. But that foolish servant, what was he doing? He was thinking, but his thought was, well, I have plenty of time to take care of those things. Plenty of time to consider that. But in doing so, he ended up doing nothing. He didn't even take care of his basic responsibilities. You see, that's the myth. Someday we're doing what we've always done. Because when we do what we've always done, we're really not quite doing what we've always done. We've just kind of set it in motion. And then we think, well, I don't have to do anything else, right? Well, it's all taken care of. I don't want to change. I don't want to do anything different. I don't want to expand. I don't want to get any. What we're really saying is, I want to take it easy. You ever see a plate spinner? It used to be one of those popular things. The guys would be a plate spinner. He'd get a plate and he'd stick it on a stick and he'd start spinning it. And it would stay in place because that centrifugal motion would keep it there. And he could take some time and go over and he could start another one and another one. And you couldn't believe how many he had going. But if you ever noticed, he'd always go back to that first one and the second one and he would spin it a couple more times. Because he knew if he stopped, if he let it go, eventually that energy would run out, it would wobble and fall. And probably take out everything when it did. Because he could always do more if he continued. He could put in more, but he had to keep maintaining what he was doing. Too many times we get something spinning and we say, well, that's good, and we just sit down and we forget about it. Then we wonder why it falls. Our walk is not one to, our rest does not come in the now, it comes in the when. We must be about our business. To be that wise servant whom the master finds doing what he told us to do when he comes. Not putting it off for a later date, not saying when it's more convenient, when I have an easier schedule. See, foolish thinking is to take it easy when we should be thinking, how can we do it better? How can we be more effective? How can we be better at what we need to be doing? Because if we rest on our laurels, probably things will fall apart. How else can the church be dumb in its thinking? Well, maybe it comes when we tolerate rather than teach. This comes from 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 19 through 20, where Paul is very sarcastically addressing the church at Corinth. He says, for you being so wise, you tolerate the foolish gladly. You tolerate if anyone enslaves you, if anyone devours you, if anyone takes advantage of you. Church, and he's being very sarcastic because you think you're so wise because you allow things you shouldn't allow. Because you allow behavior, and the behavior that he's talking about here is from the wicked and the false teachers, but yet you just accept it. You don't do anything about it. Do harm to you. You probably heard the phrase before, the tail wags the dog. Well, that was what was happening here. Faithful were being led by the unfaithful. Maybe they were concerned, well, if we say anything, if we do anything, well, we might just run them off. They might just leave. We wouldn't have them. But what if we get fooled into thinking they're just two choices when there's more? We can either say something and make everybody mad, or we can do nothing about it and leave it at the status quo. Well, maybe there's more to do. See, that's where the Lord's servant must become a teacher. In 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 24, we're told the Lord's bondservant must not be quarrelsome, but kind to all, able to teach, and patient when wrong. Here he talks about not just being someone who would just say, well, we're done with those, but rather be someone that teaches. Yeah, I've seen that at work in the church sometimes. We look at a wicked world, how bad the world is. Well, we can complain and we can point out what it does. And we think that we've done something when we've done that. But we haven't. We've just cursed the dark. We haven't turned on the light. But the Lord's servant must be one who is able to teach, not quarrelsome, not looking for a fight, but rather to teach, who doesn't look at the difficulties that he faced as an attack, but he's patient when he's wrong. Christians, we need to make sure that we don't just ignore problems, but we seek to solve them. That we are willing to do what we need to do. Too many times people would rather complain than change. We'd rather just find fault than to fix the problem. But if you have a solution to your problem, and that's what Jesus has called his church to be. He doesn't want us to behave foolishly, but he wants us to be wise. He tells us the story about the shrewd manager, not because he's someone that we should look up to, but it is someone that we should be as smart as we need. Not, though, for our own benefit, but for the benefit of Christ and his church. To not think about just what's good now, but what will always be good. To not just sit and be satisfied where we're at, but continually moving to where we want to go. To accept things as how they are, but work to make them better. See, that's what God has done for us. God doesn't want us to be unwise. He wants us to